Welcome to New Possibilities. I speak truth to power without fear. So, today, my daughter and I went to the National Museum of African American History and Culture. I really enjoyed this experience. And I want to take our time right now to talk about the 7 things that I enjoyed about this museum. Number one, the exhibits were comprehensive. So, it covered African culture and history before the arrival in America. It covered slavery. It covered Reconstruction. It covered Jim Crow. It covered the Civil Rights Movement, the Black Power movement. It covered the emergence of Black politics in terms of with Jesse Jackson. It covered modern times, including the modern protests against police brutality. It covered the election of Barack Obama as the first African American president. It was very comprehensive. And one theme that stood out throughout that comprehensive coverage of Black history was the theme of resilience and Black excellence. So, despite all the challenges that Black people faced, despite all the adversity and the oppression, Black people were still able to strive for excellence, still able to build institutions. I've heard about how even during slavery, there were free Black communities. These free Black communities had businesses, they had schools, they had fraternal orders, they had anti slavery societies, they had people who were successful and who gave back to the community. So that was very inspiring to see what our people were able to accomplish at that time in the worst of conditions. And it gives me hope of what we can accomplish today with more opportunity than our ancestors had back in the day. One thing that I would have liked would have been if they had covered more about African history, like more about who we were before we were brought to America. They had one small section on that, as Dr. Umar Johnson pointed out. So that could have been more comprehensive. And I think that they should have had a section devoted to Black inventors, even though throughout the museum they talked about Black inventors, they talked about Black pioneers and stuff like that. But I think it could have been more comprehensive if they had a section just dedicated to Black inventions. But overall, it was very comprehensive. The second thing that I really enjoyed about this museum was that it was inclusive. It discussed the role of women in our history from the days of slavery until modern times and the civil rights movement. It also covered the radical left as well, because often what happens in a lot of these museums, they only stay with the safe subjects. Like they'll just talk about the traditional civil rights organizations without going into the history of radical groups like the Black Panther Party or like United Slaves and other groups or the Nation of Islam and the Garvey movement. But this museum covered all of that. Also, it was inclusive in terms of religion. So not only did it discuss the role of the church in the Black community, it also had a couple of exhibits dealing with the influence of the Nation of Islam and Islam in the Black community. So I was really pleased to see that. You know, they had the a Quran that Elijah Muhammad used to own as a part of the exhibit. Also, that reminds me that they had Nat Turner's Bible that he had on him when he was captured by the slave master. So that's one thing that I enjoy, just the inclusive nature of the museum. Another thing that I really enjoyed is the culture. It covered a lot of African culture, including Black music. So it talked about the influence of African Americans on American culture in terms of jazz, in terms of R&B, the blues, rock and roll, hip hop. So that's something that I really enjoyed. And I also enjoyed seeing the great athletes. They had several exhibits about African American athletes like Michael Jordan, Venus and Serena Williams. They had several other people like Muhammad Ali. Great statues and great exhibits. It was awesome. They had the statues of the activists who were at the Olympics who did the Black Power salute. It was just very awesome. I mean, the exhibits dealing with the athletic achievements of Black people and our accomplishments was very impressive, and it added an entertaining aspect to the museum. Another thing that I liked about it, the fourth thing that I liked about it, was just the aesthetics of the museum, the way it was designed, the way it has different levels in the design and the artwork and the statues, the quality and uh, of the exhibits and the statues and everything, the way everything was arranged. It was awesome. The fifth thing that I enjoy about the museum is the prime location of the museum. You know, it's in the heart of the museum district in DC, so where all the key museums are situated. That museum is right there. It's right there near the Washington Monument, a great location for the museum. The sixth thing that I really like about it is just the fact that there is a high demand. You know, there are lots of people going to this museum. The demand is so high that it is very hard to get tickets to the museum. You have to order your tickets way in advance unless you have connections and all that kind of stuff. And the final thing that I enjoyed about the museum is how it had many documentaries. So there were stations where you could watch documentaries throughout the exhibits for different stages and different aspects of African American history. So that kind of gave life to the history. You know, it's one thing to just read about stuff, and it's quite another thing to see history in motion. And that's kind of what the documentaries did. And that reminds me of another point. Like, we often read about the horrors of slavery. One thing that really stood out about this exhibit is that they had actual whips that were used to beat slaves as a part of the exhibit. They had fragments from a slave ship. They actually had the shackles that were used to bind children and adults. So it's one thing to talk about slavery in the abstract, and it's quite another thing to actually see tangible signs of slavery. You know, so that was powerful. And then another thing, like seeing the actual segregation signs at this museum, was just something that's hard to describe, to actually see what our people went through. So they had those colored only signs on display at this museum. So it's a great museum. I highly recommend that people go to this museum. I recommend that every single African American who's able should visit this museum. We should support this museum. And anyone who wants to know about African history, African American history, and just American history in general needs to go to this museum so that they can understand and hear about the African American experience. So I want to hear from those of you who've been to the museum. What do you think about the museum? What would you add? What other things do you enjoy about the museum? Or what things do you criticize about the museum? So I want to hear from you. Please rate, comment, and subscribe. Peace.